So let me welcome all of you to our Friday webinar series. In this Friday webinar series at EGROW Foundation, we make efforts to get the best of the best minds across the world to come and talk to us about contemporary issues. Most of the time, we focus on economic issues, but we also do defense and we do socioeconomic indicators too. We are in a very critical situation now. In the rest of the world, very aggressive interest rate formulations have taken place, and now they are sort of standstill. In our own country, we have had the budget and we have had the monetary policy, and this is the last full year budget before the election. The next full year budget will now come in 2025. We thought at this point of time, when we have the G20 presidency, we have the full year budget presented, we have the monetary policy presented, let's listen to the expert on various issues. So we invited, and I'm really lucky to say that Professor Panagariya agreed to join us today and discuss about the state of the economy. Professor Panagariya actually needs no introduction in our country. Everybody knows about him and respectfully knows him. He was the vice chairman, the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog from January 2015 to August 2017. And during these years, he also served as India's G20 Sherpa and led the Indian teams that negotiated the G20 communique during presidencies of Turkey, China, and Germany. Professor Panagariya is a former chief economist of the Asian Development Bank and was on the faculty of Department of Economics at the University of Maryland at College Park. And during these years, between 78 and 2003, he also worked with the World Bank, IMF, UNCTAD in various capacities. He holds a PhD degree in economics from Princeton University, a very prestigious place. Professor Panagariya has authored more than 15 books, and some of his books are fabulous, I think must read for students of economics in India. Scientific papers by Professor Panagariya have appeared in the top economic journals such as the American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economic Studies, and International Economic Review, while policy papers by him have appeared in the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He writes frequently in various places, including Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, India Today, and Times of India. And that is where I think he reaches millions in India who then look forward to his next column all the time. He was honored with Padma Bhushan, the third highest civilian honors the country bestows in any field. He is right now Professor of Economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. With this, I welcome Professor Panagariya to speak to us about the Indian economy, the state of the Indian economy for about 40 minutes. And then we will open the discussion for question answers in the last 15-20 minutes. So with this, over to you, Professor Panagariya.
Dr. Charan Singh, and by the way, congratulations to EGROW Foundation, right? Your founder is now a member of my ex-institution, the Niti Aayog. So I was very pleased to see that. Okay, so today we'll talk about the economy in the context of the budget. And as Dr. Charan Singh said, both the budget have been presented and passed in the parliament. and monetary policy has also been announced by the Reserve Bank of India. So it is a good time for us to talk about the state of the economy, which is the kind of formal title of the talk today. I want to begin with some little background first of where we started under the present government. That's where I will start. Quick overview of where we have come to. So the starting fact, which is often neglected, perhaps sometimes obscured, purposely so, is that in the first 5 years of the Modi government, 2014-15 to 2018-19, so this is the first term, the economy grew at 7.4% in real terms. If you read a lot of the press, you will not get that sense, but that is actually a fact. Now, the year 1920 was an exceptional year, not in the global sense or any other, but exceptional for India, for the Indian economy, when growth rate really sharply declined to 3.7%. My own view on this is that largely this was the result of the reckless lending that had happened earlier, but also to some degree a slow response of the present government. Problem was there by 2013-14 for everyone to see, but both the Reserve Bank of India as well as the Finance Ministry really did not seriously went after trying to clean up the problem until almost about 2017, by which time the credit growth had pretty much collapsed. This is not unusual, I must say, that if you look around the world, when NPAs accumulate, often this problem gets neglected. But that is all the more reason to actually, be very vigilant on this particular problem. The issues again got raised, as I'm sure you're all aware, in the context of the Hindenburg report on Adani and all. So, that's a sideshow in my view right now when we want to take an overview of the economy. But we can come to that if you wish when we come to the Q&A part of the event today. Now, so 1920, and that, at that time, that non-performing assets problem with the banks, once the government began to solve it by pushing a lot of the lenders to take their creditors to the bankruptcy court and all, then that sort of also spilled over into the non-banking finance companies, NBFC sector. And so that all of that came to a head around 2018 or so, and then ultimately culminated in the growth rate declining to 3.7% in 1920. And then, of course, COVID hit, and we reacted very sharply to the fears of COVID. At least, if I go by my own memory, I fully approved of the strict lockdown that we adopted at the time, and I still think that given the information that existed at the time about the possible threat of the infection and how ill-prepared we were, I think that was the right decision. So I stand by, my approval of it at the time as well. We eventually, I think, on the whole, except for the Delta wave, where we, slipped a little bit. Other than that, I think we both on the economic front and on the health front handled COVID remarkably well. 2.2 billion jabs, in about a year's time. Not to mention the fact that the vaccines could actually be manufactured at that pace is indeed very, very remarkable. It is quite unexpected to me when the government was announcing in 2021 that it'll manufacture that many jabs. I personally didn't quite believe those numbers, but they came to be true. They came to be true. On the economic front, I think the government did the right thing in spite of all the pressures that were put on it by very well respected economists and other commentators and all, nationally as well as internationally, to follow the United States and European Union in fiscal expansion. The government very wisely stayed away from it. For the record, I was completely with the government on that one, because the way, and I wrote about it actually, so it is not as though I'm saying this retrospectively. There are my writings from that period where, in my mind, I was very clear that this was not merely a demand shock, it was also a supply shock. And when the supply itself is disrupted, no matter how much money you're going to put in the hands of the people, it's not going to translate into actual consumption. Meaning that even if it, first of all, the way I argued was that it did not have a chance of actually converting any any transfers did not stand a chance of converting themselves into even effective demand, because if pandemic was there, you couldn't freely go out to shop, and except for the bare necessities, you did not want to go out to shop. So how could any transfers translate into even effective demand? But even if it could, there was not enough supply. People were not able to go to work, and therefore the supply chains of virtually all products had been disrupted badly as well. So I was in my mind very clear that what the government really needed to do at the time was to ensure that the poor are, especially the poor, are taken care of, and that was done. That was done by expanding very rapidly. The government also, I should say that was responding with great speed in terms of expanding the safety net on food, and that was done. There are issues of migration, etc. So there were some issues there. But overall, I think, given the magnitude of the crisis, the government actually did quite well. And that particular year, because of the very strict lockdown that India had, growth rate dropped. This is 19, and now we are talking about the year 2021. Growth rate was negative 6.6%, largely concentrated in the April, May, June 2020 quarter. There was practically over a 20% decline then. Now, for the year 2021, we were not exceptional. Again, if you look at media reports, they'll tell you that, somehow we suffered a major kind of decline and nobody else was impacted that badly because our lockdown was so strict, stricter than anybody else's. That, I think, factually is incorrect. Number of countries at the time suffered actually even larger decline in growth than we had suffered. Take, for example, Euro area, close to us, 6.4% was the decline in Euro area, compared to ours at 6.6%. But some specific countries, you take Italy, decline of 8.9%, Spain decline of 10.8%, UK decline of 9.4%. Now also, when we come to the post-COVID recovery, again, these are kind of claims made that, we managed to grow 8.7% in the year 21-22 because we were the worst hit by the strict lockdown. That also is not true, actually, because you have all these other countries that I've mentioned France, Italy, and Spain, which declined even more than we did. But when it comes to recovery, none of them was anywhere close to 8.7%. France was 6.7%, Italy was 6.2%, Spain was 4.9%, and UK was 7.2%. And all of these countries, all four of them had declined a lot more than 6.6%. So I think our recovery has been undoubtedly quite robust. It also happened fairly quickly. Again, when the Delta wave came, the quarter of April, May, June 21 was a bad quarter. And that still, therefore, means that the base in that particular quarter has remained low, which has allowed us to, again, grow in the same quarter in 2022 quite rapidly. Now, so 21-22 we grew 8.7%. 22-23, the hard figures we have is for the first half of this fiscal year. In the first half, we have grown 9.7%. Now, the CSO advance estimate on this for the full year is about 7%, which means that the CSO, or now we say National Statistical Office, NSO, estimate is 7%, which means that roughly the NSO is expecting about 4.3% growth in the second half of the current fiscal year, which will be ending on 31st March. Probably on the low side. Certainly, there is some reason to believe that it cannot be 9.7% or anywhere near that, because the base in the second half is higher, but still seems to me a bit on the low side. So in any case, conservatively, if we say 7% should, minimally, I think 7% should come to pass. I'll be rather surprised. What surprise I actually expected when the second quarter growth rate came out, which was 6.3%, I had expected it to be closer to 8%. What actually, everything else I had expected and again expressed so in some of the talks I gave around that time, was the only sector that unfortunately turned out to be unexpectedly performing very badly during the second quarter was manufacturing. I had expected at least that manufacturing will grow now 4% or so in the second quarter, but it actually fell close to about 4%, negative growth of 4%. So manufacturing, I think in India, this we have talked about, I've written about it for almost 20 years. There is something that remains a bit of an issue in India, and various efforts have been made and all, but share of manufacturing in the GDP has remained more or less constant around 17-18%, which means that basically manufacturing has been growing at the GDP growth rate, and so when GDP itself is accelerating, manufacturing accelerates. When GDP decelerates. It still, as I said, it is a bit of a disappointment in the overall picture. Okay, so that's the background. Inflation, by the way, as a result of our very prudent fiscal management, and also I think on monetary side we did ease up. We did ease up during the COVID, but still the fact that fiscally we did not make these huge transfers. Now, in a way, if you think about it, these cash transfers, especially when seen in the US and European Union context, these transfers are relatively high velocity money, because people broadly are prosperous, and these were given to not just the bottom 10 or 15%. These were given to the bulk of the population, these transfers. That is in a way what you could call high velocity money, because the moment the economies opened up, that money began to be spent, because during COVID the savings really accumulated. The US had about close to $2 trillion of extra savings accumulated during these years. And that money, then became spent money once the economy opened up. And so the US really had this major spurt in inflation. India's inflation, on the other hand, actually originated largely outside of the country. That's the global food prices went up, the energy prices went up, the crude prices went up. A lot of the other commodity prices also went up. So in a way, large part of the Indian inflation originated abroad, and we have now seen that as that inflation globally has begun to come down, our inflation rate has also come down. And the RBI was actually quite more vigilant, I would say, than the Fed ended up being in the United States, and it had begun to act sooner than the Fed did. I think we are pretty much done with. I don't expect the RBI to raise interest rates any further. It is arguable whether the current, the latest 25 basis points increase that was done by the RBI was required, because inflation is down to its tolerance level now, about 5.7%. And I say that also in the context that there is a tendency among the banks that when the interest rates are raised, they get passed on in full. But when you unwind that process and begin to, once the inflation is down and you begin to lower the interest rates, often it is not passed on, or passed on partially and with a considerable lag. And that, of course, also, then gives credence to the argument that, why lower the interest rate when it is not even passed on. I argue the opposite way, that look, if it's only partially passed on, then you need to reduce the interest rate more aggressively rather than not reduce it. But anyway, be that as it may, I think, on inflation front, I now see the road as sort of cleared up. Now, signs of recovery, in the Indian economy, the vital, at least one particular statistic at which I like to look is the investment to GDP ratio. And that, I think, is now showing signs of recovery. There is no question, consistently this investment to GDP ratio has been on the rise. And from something like, 30% in the year 2021, 30.5% is the figure I have. The latest year, 22-23, projected one in that advance estimate that I referred to earlier, that ratio is about close to 34%. It's 33.9, so closest rounding up, 34%. That's a great sign, from 30.5% to come to about 34. That's a 3.5 percentage point increase. Some of this increase is of course also the public investment increase. The government has been pretty good at actually expanding the role of the government, infrastructure spending and all. But largely it is private investment. Now this is the other thing that you commonly hear, that private investors are not investing. Nonsense, because you can't get 34% without the private investors investing big time. Because ultimately, when you take central government, you would all remember from the recent budget presentation that what the government plans to spend in the coming year is 3.3% of the GDP. And in the previous year, it was, I think, 2.9% or 2.7%, but below 3%, 2.9, I think. So that's the central government, and there might be another 3% or 3.5% from the state governments. Well, that's still somewhere between 6 and 7% of the GDP. So out of 34%, the remaining is actually private sector investment. So this whole argument that often gets made that somehow India's investment is being driven by public investment is quite misplaced, because in the end, overall aggregate investment cannot be driven by the public investment. It's very important investment, I don't want to downplay. And I was actually pitching, even before the budget was presented, for the finance minister to actually continue on the road to accelerating the investment in infrastructure. And my reasons were different, is that, for the first time, really there is a government in place which is incredibly effective at building infrastructure, at, doing projects at scale and projects at speed. Unlike, during the second term of the UPA, when these projects got stuck in very badly, either in environmental clearances or interministerial turf battles, or not being able to acquire land, or whatever, for whatever reason, these projects were simply not moving. And there's a, I remember when the Modi government came, there was a huge backlog of incomplete infrastructure projects. So they have all been cleared, new projects, and now the new projects really happen rapidly. Road construction is happening, all the railways are being built up, and also it's very important investment. This government is very capable, able to do these projects at scale and speed. So every good reason for it to stay the course on that. And I, for the first time, even said that, look, if it ultimately amounts to, if it implies that to increase infrastructure spending, the government has to compromise a bit on the fiscal consolidation objective. I mean, if that is the kind of conflict one faces, then I would actually relent on the fiscal consolidation objective, rather than give up on the infrastructure spending component of it. So I think, the government has tried to walk a fine line there, that it also increased the infrastructure, or the capital expenditure to 3.3% of the GDP from 2.9%, which was itself, by the way, if you go back 4 years, the spending had been around strictly less than 2 percentage points, or 2% of GDP. So this is a massive kind of expansion if you look in proportionate terms. So, so the government decided to walk the thin line, raised it to 3.3% of GDP, but it has also it is also aiming for a modest fiscal consolidation. So, from 6.4% of the GDP, fiscal deficit is pegged at 5.9%. Now, there have been some, talk about a very large part of the government expenditures going to interest payments, which is true. So out of this 5.9%, about I think about 3.3% or 3.6% for the 23-24 year is expected to be interest payments. So it's a very large component of the government expenditure. The flip side of it, which people don't seem to understand or realize, is that, that part of the deficit goes back to the private investors. Remember that this is interest payment, therefore it is paid to somebody, meaning, this is whoever is holding the government securities get paid, and that goes back into the circulation of the economy. And so ultimately it will end up in the hands of the private investors. Because remember, when the government is paying as interest, it's not buying any resources out of the economy using those funds. Those funds go back into circulation of the economy and therefore aid the private investment. So that, in a way, I sort of, don't, unless the interest payments are a threat to the macro stability, which they are not by any stretch of imagination currently, because the nominal growth rate far exceeds the interest rate. And so you want to look at the interest rate in relation to the nominal growth, nominal interest rate in relation to the nominal growth rate. And if the nominal growth rate far exceeds the interest rates, largely I think we are safe on macroeconomic stability side. And if the interest, if part of the government's revenues are ending up back in the hands of the private investors, so much the better. I think that's a productive investment. So I don't see that as a major negative, as long as those interest payments are the high interest payments are not indicative of macroeconomic instability. I think then I think we are quite safe, and I don't see that as a curse. Now, in the budget, of course, so fiscal deficit I've talked about, the capital spending I've talked about, two or three subjects, two more maybe. One which was very close to my heart, which has to do with the personal income tax reform, because I wrote about this, just 2 weeks before the budget came. So for me, that was almost a gift. That the precisely what I had actually asked for is what obviously Finance Minister had been already thinking about, and that was that look, in the year 2021, the government had begun a bit of a reform of the personal income taxation. It had introduced an alternative schedule, so it gave the option to the taxpayers to continue to use the older system, which had remained in place and still remains in place, or use the alternative tax rates, which were somewhat lower than those which were allowed when you were using exemptions. So the government said, like, look, if you forego a large part of the exemptions, then you can file your tax returns under this alternative tax schedule in which the tax rates are lower. For somebody like me who had always zero exemptions, and I still file taxes in India, so I did use that alternative tax return. But when I spoke to a lot of the taxpayers in India, including my own brother and brother-in-law and so forth, who are all very, very middle class, they were all saying that the alternative tax schedule was simply not attractive enough for them. So I had pitched in this article about 2 weeks before the presentation of the budget that the finance minister should now make this alternative tax schedule more attractive, such that a large number of taxpayers will move to this alternative. Because in the end, what is very important is to end all this exemption raj. This only entity that benefits from it is the chartered accountants. And some of the chartered accountants that I spoke to even said that they were not happy because it was so complicated that they would rather have some simplification themselves. And some of the provisions apparently in the whole tax code as it currently exists are even internally contradictory. So it's a nightmare even for the officials actually to sort out where the taxpayer is genuinely using an exemption and where it is actually cheating on the government. So I think a lot of cleaning up is required, and this is now a very good step because the tax rates have been brought down significantly in this schedule which had been introduced in 2021. So it is my kind of expectation based on everything that I have seen, is that many taxpayers, particularly those who are probably with incomes of 15 lakhs or less, or even 20 lakhs or less, certainly 15 lakhs or less, will begin to file their returns under the alternative. So that will be a big major cleanup, and I think once some experience has been had for a year or two with this new schedule, I think the government can then proceed with the obvious conclusive step where it closes the option of the exemption-ridden system and replaces it by a new tax code, which is much more simplified and all. So that was good news. I've been writing quite a bit on custom duties as well. It's sort of, I feel, mine is practically the lone voice on this because I come from very much of a free trade perspective, not in any ideological sense, but based on tons and tons of evidence, quite unequivocal. That ultimately for us, particularly to make a success of manufacturing and particularly of labor-intensive manufacturing, we got to succeed in the global economy, and you cannot succeed in the global economy by putting high barriers to trade. It is, this is a kind of long-standing intellectual baggage that we have carried. I mean, right now, I'm writing, my current really major project is on the Nehru era, And you see that, how we believe that we could do export promotion and import substitution at the same time. And it just doesn't work that way. It simply doesn't work. I thought at least, that we had learned that fact finally in 1991, and we had begun to disabuse ourselves of that particular theory that, you can do on the one hand import substitution, on the other we can do export promotion. And we had begun to liberalize in a systematic sort of way, which we did do actually for almost 2 decades. But we have gone back on that. So there appears to be some, at least move in the right direction on that front finally in the budget. How effective it will be, I think it will need to be studied. But one of the announcements that the finance minister made was that she was reducing the number of custom duty rates outside of a couple of products. I think, she said textile and clothing and one another product. There were 21 tariff rates. So they will be now consolidated into 13 tariff rates. So if correctly done, I think, in the process of that rationalization, one can also put an end to a lot of the, what we say, inversion in the tariff structure. Inversion meaning that, there are lots of sectors where inputs are taxed at higher rates than the final product. And normally you don't want to do that. I think the best way to go about it is to tax these different stages of production inputs, whether it's at the level of the component or at the level of raw materials, etc. And the final product, the best thing is to tax them put a tariff at the same rate. And I have often argued actually, that we should really roll back all the tariffs and to consolidate basically into about a 7% tariff rate. 7% being, in my judgment, a safe revenue neutral rate. But that's not where the government seems to be heading. But certainly this is a step in that right direction. When you consolidate into 13, you can eliminate at least some of the inversion in the tariff structure. So I do not know whether this will actually happen that way or not, but overall I think that is a step, at least finally on the tariff side, on custom duty side, in the right direction. Employment wise, by the way, that is another area where you hear all these numbers thrown from the CMIE, which I think is a highly unreliable survey, and I just don't recommend that. I never use that. I rely on the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, which is the survey done by the National Statistical Office. And reliable, consistent, very wide survey, properly randomized and all. And that is showing very systematically the all unemployment rates coming down. Whether you want to look at the annual rates, they've been coming down. Whether you want to look at the by usual status or current weekly status, they've been coming out down. And for urban unemployment on the current weekly status, the PLFS is now pretty up to date. Quarterly basis it produces, and it's practically concurrent now, practically with the quarterly GDP numbers. So we have till the second quarter of the year 22-23 fiscal year 2022, so which is July, August, September quarter, and urban unemployment rate is the lowest that we have recorded in the last 4 years or 5 years since 17-18 when the PLFS began. So 7.2% is the lowest urban unemployment rate that we've recorded. You look at the EPFO numbers, again, very robust numbers. The number of people, net additions to the EPF rolls are like 12 million compared with in the year 2022, I think 21-22, in comparison to less than 8 million in any of the remaining earlier 3 years. So all indicators actually are positive on that front. Finally, what needs to be done, just a couple of things I will mention, and in the remaining 1 minute, I think I can do that. Now, a lot of the reforms actually have been done, and that is work in progress in the sense that, no reform is ever completely done. Problems arise and the government has to then respond. Things like, take bankruptcy code, for instance, the original act was passed in 2016. A lot of amendments had to be done along the way as we go. Rules and regulations sometimes have to be shifted, etc. Labor laws, they were passed in 2019, but they still have not been notified. So obviously that's also work in progress that needs to be completed. The economic survey says that, about 26 of the states have put up the rules and regulations for public commenting. But in the end, unfortunately, these are laws which cannot be implemented until every single state actually comes on board, you see, because I had not understood, what the problem was, why at least it was not being implemented in the states that can move faster. Problem is the following, that the legislations also repeal the existing laws. Okay, the central, this is the concurrent subject, and in this, the central government has passed the laws, and the laws actually also repeal the existing laws which are then replaced, which that these new codes are replacing. Now, the problem is that those laws actually cannot be repealed without them being repealed in every single state and union territory, because you can't leave vacuum in the states that fail to implement fast. So in the end, that is my understanding that is the reason why, having been passed in 2019, 3 years later, we still see that these laws have not been notified. So that's where that stands. So that also needs to be done. But couple of, one area where reform is needed, it's still, it is in the new education, in the national education policy. It was also on the radar screen also finance minister, and I think in 2021 budget or 21-22 budget, she had announced that there was going to be a new law which will replace the University Grants Commission Act, but that now seems to have fallen off of the radar screen of the government. But I think, that is an area which requires a new law. The 56 law is simply too old, and a modern law is required. Then, there is ongoing agenda privatization of public sector enterprises, public sector banks, monetization of assets. So a lot of the, I think, in terms of big ticket reforms, mostly they are done, and the, what remains is often it is the work in progress, responding to challenges that emerge. But then there is a lot of this ongoing agenda, including the privatization agenda, which is extremely important, which needs to be followed up closely. So I think I'll end up there. Just one last point, where I think we are going. My own assessment really is that minimally we got to grow, we will grow about 7% a year in the coming decade. If we take a few more steps, particularly on trade liberalization, there's no reason for, and implement the labor laws, I see no reason why we couldn't shift it to about 8 to 9%. If other economies can grow at that rate, so can we. But that requires particularly some bold action on trade liberalization side. And after labor laws are implemented, some states will have to use the instrumentality of the new laws to at least some states will have to go farther than that. The laws permit states to carry the reform agenda forward, and at least some states will have to come forward to do that. If we do that, I think we can actually go to 8 to 9% growth rate. But even conservatively, I place, by 27, 28, we should be more than $5 trillion economy. And by that time, we will become the third largest. So we will cross first Germany and then Japan. So it's only 5 years away. So big change in terms of the global economy, as well as the accompanying geopolitical changes that are going to happen are afoot now, and the next decade should be a very exciting decade. Thank you. Sorry,
Professor, this was really, really very good. I have a question. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. After my question, you take a call. And then I think Professor Vishandas would like to ask a question. And then I'm going to request each one of you to raise your hand and be very brief and precise. As you will see, I will be very brief and precise in asking the questions. Now, we are really thankful to you, Professor Panagariya. You really summarized the Indian economy so well. Let me directly come to the question that I had. You are actually an expert on the Indian political economy, and that's why that's exactly the title also of the chair that you hold. Given the situation in the country, and you have been watching it closely, we have had, at least for the last 10 years, especially for the last 5 years, a single party in a domination position. And therefore, though we are not China, with one man at the helm of affairs, but with one person at the helm of affairs, China did 10% growth for 30 years at a stretch. But with one political party at the helm of affairs, with a vast majority, we have been successful in completing many reforms and initiating many more reforms. And that is what I think held us so strongly during COVID and thereafter, because there were no pulling the legs and there were no contradictions, and therefore the party could usher in, hold on, and turn India into the fastest growing economy of the world. In the next 25 years, or at least in the next 10 years, how do you visualize the Indian economy from the angle of growth and high growth that you and me have been dreaming 8% at least? The last question that I have, there's one question. The last question I have is, you are also an external sector expert. Given the global situation today, where the countries where you sit are engineering a financial recession, engineering a global recession, I must say, because they account for nearly 45% of world GDP, US, UK, and Europe put together. Against these odds, how do you think India's growth pattern will emerge, at least in the next 5 years? Thank you very much.
Okay, very quickly. So, yes, we together have dreamt of, have been dreaming of 8% plus growth. As I said earlier, this is completely achievable for us, not for a decade, but perhaps two, because, we have not had China-like growth still, right? I mean, we have done decent 7% growth for almost 17, 18 years, starting from 2003-4. But we have not grown 10%. And so our per capita income still remains 2,500. So the scope for us, is just enormous, because ultimately the technology frontier, if it is up here, we are still here, so there is a big difference, big gap. So as you catch up for the technology frontier from below here to here, from a per capita income of about 2,300-400 to here, it's pretty easy actually. You don't even have to innovate. You are using, I mean, this is what South Korea did, this is what Taiwan did, this is what China did, Singapore did, all of these countries, So there is enormous scope for us to do simply catch up. In a way, there's a good analogy, how the United States in its very early decades grew by taking advantage of the enormous natural resources. That was its big strength. It was completely unused, completely, virgin land, virgin mineral resources and all, and it sort of, in the early years could exploit those. Similarly, we got this unexploited technology still, so enormous scope to grow, but ultimately it's a function of our own policies, which we obviously for 40, 50 years had chosen not to use those technologies. Nothing, we closed down. I mean, even on very simple products like pen and pencils, etc., we were technologically backward in every product, soaps, everyday things, umbrellas. You can see the difference in quality, which of course all of this is now bridged up with the opening up after the 1990s. But they still, so there is this enormous scope. So I think, if we play it right, there is no question. And this is why I say that opening up is essential. I think, without that, for 2 decades to sustain that growth is going to be harder. I think we are not like we used to be, pre-1990. So we are still a relatively open economy, and therefore we will still grow about 7% or so. So that's my answer to the first question. And the second one, the external environment, that is also, we love to kind of, overplay that card, particularly as an apology. But that is simply, if you look at the actual numbers, given everything else that's said about protectionist sentiment, the automation, this, that, and the other, and manufacturing returning to the where the demand is, etc., etc., none of this is really actually happening. And if you look at the trade figures, so there is a trade war between US and China and all. But in spite of that, the total imports into the United States actually last year went up from China into the United States. There has been some, reconfiguring of the trade patterns and so forth. But the big picture is this: pre-COVID, at peak, the world exports in merchandise exports were 19 trillion. That was in the year 2018. So in 2018, which was the pre-COVID peak for world exports, merchandise exports were 19 trillion and services was 6 trillion. So total $25 trillion export market. Now remember, that's in relation to our economy, which is 3.4 trillion, so roughly thereabouts. Okay, 25 trillion. Then of course, post-COVID, we thought that, this process has come to an end because both COVID hit and that all the protectionist sentiment and all the automation stuff going on and all. 2021, 22 trillion merchandise exports. From 19 trillion, they go up to 22 trillion. That's 2021. Services, 6 trillion. Total 28 trillion. 2022, the last year, the latest year for which we have the figures. Merchandise exports, 25 trillion. And services exports, 7 trillion. $32 trillion. So from the pre-COVID peak of 25 trillion in world exports, merchandise and services combined, 32 trillion now in 2022. So our problem is not the world markets. Our problem is what kind of share we are able to carve out for ourselves in that market. And I'm afraid, we are stuck at 1.6, 1.7% in the merchandise trade. In services, we have a little over 2%, somewhere between 2 and 3%. But, look at Chinese share in merchandise exports, about 12%. We don't need 12%, but we got to have at least 4 or 5%. That all depends on what we do domestically. And I think, still, by the way, I forgot to mention land markets also. Our factor markets are still a problem. Very serious problem. Both labor markets are a problem and land markets are a very serious problem. So, if you look at the allocation of our capital, all of the capital is sitting in sectors that hardly use any labor. And that has actually starved the vast population of workers, vast mass of workers of any capital whatsoever. All the workers are sitting in these micro and small enterprises where they have no capital. But even in labor intensive sectors, you need some capital to be truly productive. If you're going to catch up with the world technology, you've got to have some capital. Even apparel industry, there are labor within apparel industry, there are labor intensive processes and there are capital intensive processes. Although all of those processes use a lot more labor per unit of capital, but you need to get scale, to be competitive in the global marketplace, you need some capital. And what we are doing is basically starving the mass of the workers of any capital. I mean, just think about, what kind of capital does your plumber come when he comes to fix things in your house, or what kind of capital does the gardener comes with, I mean, I used to see this in my own house when I was at Niti Aayog, and I said, in the US, I myself was able to do many of these tasks in the gardening much faster than these others because I had the tools, and these guys will come in with very little tools.
Professor, that's very good, remarkable. I've been thinking about the same, but at some other day, offline, we'll talk about it. In a country which you have so many people, if you really automate gardening and things like that, what would they do rest of their time? And I've been thinking, and I'll come back to you on that. But we have so many other people lined up, and we are running out of time so badly. So, Professor Base Barua, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Professor Panagariya, it's always very interesting to hear you. And your book on the Indian economy, I think, is still very, very favorite among students and us. Almost, I think you have partly given the answer what I was going to ask you. See, we see that in 85 to 90% of our workers are in the unorganized sector where there's cutthroat competition. There are no sort of social securities are practically not there. So how do you foresee, the conversion change on the ratios from 15% organized to 85% organized sector workers and all that? I think this is a very critical issue regarding how we can make the growth, more sort of what you call how prosperity from growth can be shared by the more number of people.
I think that is absolutely the problem of India. That is the problem of India, because ultimately transformation is all about that, giving good jobs to the workers, to the large part of the workforce. Once you do that, actually the remaining ones automatically will get better jobs. You see, because currently the labor market is totally fragmented. The whole ecosystem is defined by these 85% of the workers who are in small and micro units. So you can see even the wages, I mean, I'll give you one example, my favorite one. You look at China, because about 75% of the workforce is either in medium or large size firms, where medium is defined as with workers 50 to 200 and large is more than 200 workers. So, less than 50 workers, those enterprises employ about 25% of the workforce. But even those 25% of the workforce, have average labor productivity, which is about 60% of the others. In India, if you do that comparison, the small guys, about 85% are sitting in these enterprises with less than 50 workers, and the average labor productivity there is only 20% of what it is in the large enterprises. Because the whole ecosystem is not, in China, you have to compete. These people who are sitting in these small enterprises, the 25%, the medium and large enterprises have to compete for that workforce also. And given that the wages and productivity has to be raised in these others also. But in India, the whole ecosystem is defined by these 85% where the small enterprises, less than 50, so there is enormous slack in the labor market, ultimately translating into low labor productivity. There's no way around, for somebody to attack that problem more directly. But I'm afraid I'm not so optimistic on that being happening, because this whole, 75 years of socialist baggage has continued with us. So planners always go for big things. So we wanted steel mills, we wanted machinery factories, we wanted fertilizer factories, we wanted chemical factories. And we said, rest, let's go do this cottage industry, you know, let the cottage industry employ labor, let the cottage industry produce consumer goods. That was your area of comparative advantage. You should have been capturing the global marketplace in those products. We chose not to. And till today, including in the present government, you know, what are we attracted to? High-tech industry. We want to do automobiles, want to do aircraft, we want to do all sorts of fancy products. But there is no attention really paid. I mean, you can look at PLI. Where is the capital going? Now, it's that you return to the old problem. You know, when you say PLI, basically when you incentivize these very highly capital-intensive sectors through these subsidies, you are disincentivizing the rest of the sectors, which is where, you know, a lot of the employment is sitting. You know, when you incentivize one or two sectors, maybe you can say it's incentive. But once, you know, you are incentivizing 10 sectors, you automatically, anybody who is left out of these incentives is disincentivized. And often in the disincentivized sector, people sitting are these big, you know, where the workers are, the labor intensive industries, or your successful export industries. Export industries that are succeeding, they don't get any help. It's the import competing which are failing largely. I mean, you know, I don't want to overstate that part, but you see, and even the incentives are related to capital, how much investment you do, how much sales you do, and that being the case, it's the other sectors which will be then deprived of capital. And so unless we overcome that, recognize the fact that ultimately our really big resource is labor, still our, you know, compared to the rest of the world, our big resource is not capital, our big resource is labor. And unless we attack that side head on by bringing capital, even if, you know, it is a small amount of per capita capital, but I mean, because there is deprivation from capital is so much that even small amounts of capital, if it comes into these sectors, will do wonders in raising labor productivity. So on that front, this is why I sort of, you know, say that probably will grow only 7% in the next 2 decades, not at 9-10% as China did, or South Korea did, or Taiwan did in the 60s and 70s. But that's how it is.
Thank you very much. I'm really, I mean, it gives me a clue to think about. Thank you.
Yeah. So we are beyond 9. Professor, can you take 2 more questions, and you then decide how much time you have and how much time you need to answer? Can I just request 2 more professors to ask their question?
Let's go.
Or you want to close? It's 9 o'clock already.
No, that's okay. Let's go. I mean, you know,
So
I realize my own answers are long, so
that's okay. So we'll have 2 more questions, last 2 questions, one from Professor Behra and one from Professor Kurian. And both of you, please ask your question one after the other. Then we leave it to the professor to answer, and then we'll close after that. Professor Behra first. Can you be a little louder?
Sir, thank you, sir, for giving me an opportunity to interact. Panagariya, sir, I'm a bit nervous. I'm a student of economics. My question is, we are observing that there are news of mass layoffs all over the globe. My question is how it is going to affect our Indian economy. Thank you, sir.
Professor Kurian. Hello, Professor Kurian. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I put my thanks to Professor Panagariya for giving an excellent presentation of the topic. I have 2 simple queries. One is on inclusion and the other is on employment. You surveyed the recent developments of the Indian economy only in terms of GDP growth. But we have so many data from global as well as Indian sources, which blame the problem of exclusion. The vast majority of Indians are poor and they are not being included in the whole growth process. So how do you view this problem? That is one of my questions. The second is on the question of employment, which you referred to. And there is a new type of employment crunch. That is, most of the technology firms all over the world, as well as in India, they are cutting jobs. So what will be the implication of this to modern jobs? Thank you again for your excellent presentation.
First of all, on this question of mass layoffs abroad, at least the United States, with which I am pretty familiar, there are no mass layoffs. There are some layoffs in the technology sector, to which I'll come in a second. But on a net basis, even the last month, the United States has added 512,000 jobs, 512,000 jobs. So the US unemployment rate is now down to the lowest ever, 3.4 or 3.5%, unheard of in the US, at least not in the last 5 decades. Apparently, because the tech industry is on everybody's radar screen, we are all on Twitter, etc. Therefore, when Google says I'm laying off 10,000 or Microsoft says I'm laying off this many, we really kind of see those numbers. But these are not large numbers when we look at the overall employment situation, not in the United States in any case. Europe may be different. I'm less familiar, so I would hold my comment on that. How is this going to impact India? Well, within the tech industry, obviously it's a globalized industry. So what happens in the US may impact in India also. But by the way, so the way Professor Kurian kind of phrased it, that we are facing some kind of another kind of employment problem and all. Look, that is a good sign. Restructuring should be a continuous process, and this doesn't happen without some layoffs. So it is at the personal. I understand at the personal level, this is a painful thing. Nobody wants to lose a job. Nobody wants to move. But at the end of the day, if the US economy is so dynamic, it is because its labor markets and conversely, the European economy does so badly, generally, overall. It is because the labor market in the US is incredibly flexible, and in Europe, it's not. So you want some flexibility. I mean, my lament has been that we don't move enough. Look, how slow the movement of workers out of agriculture into industry and services has been in India. It's still 45% of the workforce sitting in agriculture. We got to move, So we are. Our philosophy has been that you don't come to us, we will bring the job to you. Well, you can wait for a whole generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, and job doesn't come to you. You have to go where the jobs are. And so smarter Biharis and smarter Uttar Pradeshis and others are going where the jobs are. They are going to Kerala, they are going to Maharashtra, they are going to Gujarat and so forth, in Punjab. So that is how, a dynamic economy always requires some movement. But our tech industry actually is a net job creator, from nothing. It's now employing probably 3 to 4 million people, and it has considerable scope. It will continue to grow. So, because you hear some things that happen in a particular month or 2 months, that is of not long-term consequence necessarily, unless something fundamentally wrong is happening in the economy, which I don't see is happening. So again, economists look at the aggregate picture. Sociologists like to look at more at the individual level, and those are 2 very different perspectives. So for me, you are going to get the economist perspective that look, this kind of movement of workers, restructuring, etc., is important. It's a very essential part of a dynamic economy. On inclusion, I have to disagree completely, in fact, because the only time any inclusion has happened is when growth began to happen. I mean, on that, the empirical evidence is absolutely incontrovertible, and I've documented it. Actually, I wrote a whole book called Why Growth Matters with Jagdish Bhagwati, where we systematically actually dissect this whole subject, that in the end it is growth which has done good to the poor. I mean, if we had continued to listen to the Amartya Sen, who was always deriding growth, we would have never got where we got. Ultimately it is the Bhagavati view of the world which thankfully prevailed. And that is how lots of people have been, I mean, hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of abject poverty. Now, I understand that because you come out of abject poverty doesn't mean that, you are prosperous. Prosperity means a lot more. And this is where I think, everything I'm talking about, that, bring some, you need to spread the capital over wider workforce. You need to have workers migrate to where the good jobs are. Just look at where the bulk of the population in the US lives, on the two coasts. The middle is largely empty, very, very sparsely populated. Look at China. Where is the workforce? I mean, where are people? It's on the southern and eastern coast. Much of the middle of China and even large part of the western China are very sparsely populated. We are still the country where we have these 600,000 habitations, 600,000 habitations of, most of them are a few thousand. You just see the challenge of bringing every single public good to the population when the population is so sparsely populated. I mean, I come from Rajasthan, so I know the problem. To bring electricity to a dhani, as it is called, in the local language, of 500 people, you have to bring miles and miles long wire and electricity poles, to ultimately get electricity to that habitation. I think we need to incentivize people to move. In the end, if generation after generation wants to continue to live there, it's very difficult to bring development there. So this whole mindset has to readjust a bit.
Okay, I must thank you, Professor. We are already 12 minutes ahead of our scheduled time, so we thank you. Excellent presentation that you made as expected, but I thought the question answer session also added tremendously to the discussion, and we have benefited from your thoughts again. So we want to just thank you for accepting our invite and spending more than an hour with us and clarifying thoughts and clarifying how the Indian strategy has been carried through. You've been at the helm of affairs, both as a practitioner at Niti Aayog and then a professor at the best place. So we're really thankful to you for sharing these thoughts with us. I now would like to share, by tomorrow noon, your presentation will be on our website, and we would be happy if you and others would like to share your presentation with anyone and everyone in the world, because so meaningful and it is so analytical and still so simple in the words. I really like the question that you had on unemployment, and I think your clarification is really very good. We all need to think through this, as well as the emphasis on MSMEs and the unorganized sector. Next Friday, we have Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, presenting his book, the latest book that he has written, The Revolutionaries, on our forum. And as you know, the book is beautiful, beautiful book, where he is giving another version of the independence and the theory of independence in our country. He brings forth a fact that without the revolutionaries, probably independence would not have happened. While yes, Mr. Gandhi and his non-violence did have a role, but even the role of the revolutionaries can't be undermined. Having gone through his book and seen some of the presentations where the book was launched, I can tell you that's going to be a very interesting session next Friday. So we'll send you the flyer as far as the time is concerned, but the topic is Sanjeev Sanyal and his book on revolutionaries. With that, let me once again thank Professor Panagariya and all of you for doing this late evening session. I'm really happy to see that the audience, we crossed 120. That means our experimentation with this time slot has worked. And of course, with Professor Panagariya as the speaker, obviously do get large audience. So thanks to all of you. Good night and see you next Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh.
Thank you.